Hi everyone, welcome to week 5 of digital hermeneutics. Last week we discussed the influence of phenomenology on the so-called ontological turn in hermeneutics and how it highlights the intrinsic relatedness of humans and the world. This week we will draw on these insights to discuss interpretative issues that are near and dear to the digital humanities. What phenomenology teaches us is that we also have to look at the relation between humans and the technology they use to get to know the world. We'll focus in particular on platform hermeneutics, that is, the interpretative issues arising on online platforms such as Reddit. We will see how hermeneutics can help us expose the complexities of the digital platforms on which most people are communicating these days. And finally, to show how these complexities also involve researchers like us, who are scrutinizing these platforms. Today we will discuss postphenomenology, incidentally a good Scrabble word. We will look at the issues of post-truth in the digital age, and we will look at the distinctive aspects of discourses on Reddit. First, postphenomenology. This here is an image of Don Ihde. He's an American philosopher of science and technology. In 1979, he wrote what is often identified as the first North American work on the philosophy of technology, called Technics and Praxis. And Ihde is the main figure in what has been called the postphenomenological movement. So we're moving on here from last week's phenomenology. Ihde offers a new direction to it, a bit of American pragmatism, to counteract the romanticism and also the pessimism that often accompanies phenomenology. As you'll remember, phenomenology is about how the world appears to us, how it always already makes sense to us, and how we are embedded in it. How we can't hear a pure noise, but we're always hearing something that we make sense of. In Husserl's terms, this is the intentional relation we have to the world. So what is about post-phenomenology? Primarily, it tries to move beyond the pessimism towards technology that we find in a lot of 20th century phenomenology and existentialism. A lot of this has to do, again, with Heidegger and his very romanticist views on the originality of natural perception. We discussed Heidegger's influence last week. What I did not mention is that he's also one of the foremost 20th century philosophers on technology. His view on technology and the modernity that it represents follows from his other ideas, and it's really quite dystopian. To Heidegger, technology constitutes a completely new way of being, one that is all about control and utility. The world and our being in the world becomes a repository of objects, of raw material to be used for our own purpose, and at the cost of its intrinsic value. To make matters worse, once we start viewing things in this way, this cannot be undone. Heidegger says every attempt to design our way out of this design attitude only draws us further in. And this results in a final alienation from ourselves, an obstacle that prevents us from becoming authentic, in Heidegger's terms. Ihde argues against this reification, in which technology is sort of viewed as a general, overarching structure. Instead, he wants to discuss the particular relations that technology enables, instead of just tarnishes, between humans and the world. So it applies that fusion between subjects and objects from phenomenology to technology. Technology organizes our lives, our relation to the world, in particular ways. As we have seen elsewhere in the past few weeks, Ihde views the history of hermeneutics as a history of attempts to create a science of interpretation. But he also wants to focus on science itself and really bridge the gap between hermeneutics and positivism that has marked our entire historical overview. Hermeneutics, he says, is not just appropriate to the humanities, but to the sciences as well. So, the defining trait of post-phenomenology is that technology is introduced as the intrinsic relation that humans have to the world. Here you see the classic phenomenological paradigm, where humans are related to the world. What happens in post-phenomenology is technology is put in between it. Ihde here also takes a cue from Maurice Merleau-Ponty. This was a French philosopher, phenomenologist, who was interested in phenomenology as a theory of perception instead of hermeneutics. So to him, it wasn't so much about how we interpret, but about how we perceive the world. And using that phenomenology of perception, Ihde points out that technologies such as infrared don't alienate us from, for instance, wood. Infrared shapes a new relation. It allows us to experience wood in a new way, for instance, to see if it's sick. As such, Ihde especially emphasizes the visual nature of the hermeneutics of science. In fact, you can experiment with these technological augmentations that we have as humans. In one of his first books, Experimental Phenomenology, Ihde proposes experiments with technologies such as echolocation. I mean, you can walk around the room with your eyes closed, clapping with your hands in order to sense your surroundings like a bat. In other words, technologies allow you to experience the world in a certain way. When they are Zuhanden, to speak with Heidegger, they become extensions of ourselves. If you consider yourself a good driver, for instance, you will recognize that this goes for all kinds of technologies. You know intuitively how wide your car is when you're parking it. You know how fast it will accelerate when you're overtaking at the last minute, and so on. And more than that, driving cars makes people relate to the world in new ways. They are more in a hurry. They are more aggressive in their own little enclosed spaces. Recall that under Heidegger's view, technologies are from design on created instrumentally in order to transform particular human experiences. Ihde calls this the non-neutrality of technology. Right? Eyeglasses correct vision, knives cut our vegetables, pens allow us to write. Remember Heidegger's hammer from last week as well. It mediates between us and the world in some way. There's a saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, saying we shouldn't over-rely on certain tools. But the point of phenomenology is that indeed, that is the kind of mediation that the hammer allows for. When you are a hammer, the world is composed of nails. Ihde doesn't stop here, though. The fact that technologies are inextricably linked with humans in culture implies that technologies have no essence. They are only what they are in their use. Ihde names this ambiguity of technology multi-stability. And we can illustrate this multi-stability through this famous duck/rabbit drawing. What it is depends on how you look at it. Mediations are not in the technologies, in other words, they are outcomes of our relations to them. Ihde uses these kinds of examples in order to say that the mediations that technology affords are not in the technologies, they are outcomes of our relations to them. To Ihde, what this means is that no technology simply follows its designed or essential intent. For instance, the graphic pencil, designed to be a writing tool, can also be used and is often used by school kids to serve as a form of weaponry. As such, Ihde's approach to technology is really an analysis of various types of relations between human beings, technology, and the world. Ihde classifies a number of different relations that we can have with technology and the world, and the arrows here represent how humans get to know the world using technology. First, in embodiment relations, technologies form a unity with the human being. And this unity is directed at the world. For instance, we speak with other people through the phone rather than speaking to the phone itself. We look through our glasses rather than at them. Hermeneutic relations, as Ihde calls them, are relations in which human beings read how technologies represent the world. For example, an MRI scan that represents brain activity. Here, technologies form a unity with the world, rather than with the human being using that technology. So we're not really directed towards the world here. Instead, we are directed towards the ways in which technology represents the world. In alterity relations, human beings interact with technologies, with the world at the background of this interaction. Examples are human-robot interactions, or even just getting money from an ATM, or operating a machine. Finally, in background relations, technologies are the context for human experiences and actions. The sounds of air conditioners and fridges, the warm air coming from heating installations, the notification sounds from cell phones when you're in a restaurant. All of these examples show that technology is a context for human experience and existence, rather than something that's being experienced itself. Of course, there are exceptions to this. Sometimes we do focus on this contextual technological presence because it makes us feel safe or at home. So, Ihde's conception of hermeneutics is all about materiality. It says our relation to the world doesn't just happen in our minds, it's something we do, it's practical, it's related to objects. We do read the world, and that's the hermeneutical part, but we do so through our interactions with technologies. The image you see here is a doctored one. No one can see this kind of universe with their bare eyes. You need a camera with a very long shutter time in order to catch enough light to see the universe like this. This is why I like this picture. The inclusion of the telescope in this image is kind of nice. It shows how we need these external tools in order to interpret the world and indeed to do science. Or take this image. As a human, you would not be able to see this, if only because it is about as big as a grain of rice when you hold it in front of you. If you've got a Hubble Space Telescope, however, to point at this particular spot, and you do so for 12 days straight, the light hitting the telescope's receptors will slowly start filling in this picture until you get this. The most distant ones are these tiny red dots, and they're tens of billions of light years away. And they date back to a couple of 100 million years after the Big Bang itself. So the scientific value of this image is tremendous. It would be tempting to view this positivistically. These instruments simply allow us to see the external world more clearly. However, the point of postphenomenology is there is no other way for astronomy to see these galaxies. Without these instruments, our eyes cannot see them. The same goes for the methods that we are using in this course. For instance, this week you'll be training a word embeddings model, which typically has hundreds of so-called dimensions. That is the total number of features that it encodes. But how to visualize this in a way humans can understand? If you have more than 3 features, it's already extremely difficult to visualize the clustering in a way that is readable for a human being. In order to visualize the output of a word embeddings model, you typically engage in what's called dimensionality reduction. So reducing all of these dimensions to 2 of them, which we are able to parse. So in order to create a visualization, you typically engage in what's called dimensionality reduction. And that means you reduce all these dimensions to just the x and a y axes, 2 dimensions, in order to be able to parse the output. These issues are extremely relevant in every aspect of AI and machine learning. Machines can see things in ways we cannot. So there's always an act of translation and interpretation in order to make sense of them. The point here is that there is a hermeneutics of the instrument. This is what Ihde means with his hermeneutic relations that we saw earlier. What makes things even more complicated is that there's typically multiple competing ways of visualizing certain computational models. Is one of them the best one? Do they need to be combined? What makes for a good interpretation of the instrument that we are using ourselves? These are the kinds of questions that Ihde raises, and I think we would do well to keep them in mind when doing research. The idea of competing interpretive frameworks in an age of big data leads to a topic that is very widely discussed these days and that we might call hermeneutic overload. This is something that, as a society, we have to deal with every single day. One way of talking about it is through the term post-truth, and that's a term that refers to the gradual erosion of trust in objective facts. In her article on these issues, The Guardian editor-in-chief Catherine Viner also discussed the rise of clickbait, so articles of dubious factual content with a misleading headline designed to be widely shared. She defines post-truth as the quality of preferring concepts or facts one wishes to be true rather than concepts or facts one knows to be true. This condition of post-truth springs from a very specific configuration of human computational interaction. The internet we have at the moment is built on so-called Web 2.0 ideas in which information production is in the hands of every individual who has something to say. The amount and speed of information shared online as such is staggering. Secondly, we face this unprecedented privatization of the public sphere, in which a significant part of the shared information flows through proprietary platforms and services. In order to retain users, practically all of these platforms make use of recommendation algorithms. This can result in what has been called the filter bubble, a situation in which an internet user encounters only information and opinions that conform to and reinforce their own beliefs. Basically, we're being catered to by algorithms that filter the information they show us based on our political or consumptive or aesthetic preferences. This has significant implications for the amount of scrutiny that's put on the claims that are made online. Political discussion isn't only decentralized, we're also constantly distracted from it as political motivations are buried under personal and commercial ones. News messages are increasingly designed not just to be optimized for search engines, this is called SEO, but also with sensationalism and virality in mind. This is where clickbait comes in again. Not only does this decentralize political discussion, it also distracts from it by burying political motivations under personal and commercial ones. There is also the politicization of facts. The word that we just used, fake news, in order to describe this phenomenon of disinformation, has also been used by politicians to sow mistrust in traditional journalism. We might call it a form of political positivism. This strategically caused erosion of trust in legacy media makes it increasingly difficult for citizens to find impartial footing for claims of scientific evidence and objective facts. Basically, the claim that constructionists have been making for decades now is evidenced by extensive online communities sharing what's called alternative facts, dis and misinformation. As long as facts are presented in a framework in which they make sense, there's little need for positivistic checks and balances. Instead of decrying these developments as postmodern issues with society, as some would do, we should try to understand these processes of insulated information creation and distribution. What all these processes result in has been called the crisis of expertise. In recent political debates, there's been a significant change in the connotation of the word experts. What used to be considered a superlative has become a pejorative. Whether it's Brexit or climate change or vaccinations, there's a palpable mistrust of experts and a tendency to dismiss their advice. On the other hand, and this is where the paradox comes in, we see a very strong belief in objectivity when it accompanies practices of datafication. So, the transmission of all kinds of phenomena to a quantified format, allowing for real time tracking and predictive analysis and so on. The scale on which we can map and analyze phenomena is larger than ever before, and we're often very enthusiastic about big data being able to help us get closer to reality. I mean, that's why we're all here, right? Data may seem like it's just there, like it's just made available, but it's always necessary to focus on how it has been taken from some original context and ask questions about why it was taken, and by whom, and for whom. The existence of data always implies decisions on which features are considered important and which are left out. To use Ihde's terms, data is non-neutral as well. It always serves a certain purpose. What's more, we're putting data to use very often to try and debunk the alternative facts that are out there and to see if what politicians are saying is correct. We want an objective claim to the truth. But the problem is, that's not really helping. And this is partly because the counterfactual claims in the news actually help spread this disinformation further and also further feed the conspiratorial impression that, well, something must be wrong for traditional media to respond this strongly. The point here is what we need is not just more data, but also a way of orienting ourselves to knowledge and the ways in which knowledge is constructed. Some might say that we can ascribe these problems of mis and disinformation to a lack of digital literacy. In a 2017 blog post, technology researcher Dana Boyd actually argues the opposite. She says that fake news and the spread of conspiracy theories have their origins in efforts to educate people against misinformation. It's also related to some deep-rooted cultural habits, and she says we should probably face them. First, it's about what sources we are taught to trust. From high school onwards, students are told, don't use Wikipedia for your sources. It's unreliable. Instead, you should try to do research. And as a result, the message that many people have taken home is to go to Google and use whatever comes up there first. Google is trustworthy and Wikipedia is not. So it basically became an issue of the trustworthiness of the platform instead of the kind of information that the platform orients us towards. Second, it's about critical thinking. The American ideal of personal responsibility makes it so that when it comes to information, many children are taught that they are the proprietors of knowledge. All they have to do, again, is do the research for themselves, and they will know better than anyone else what is real. They have to trust their own findings. This is coupled with a distrust of media sources. If the media is reporting on something and you don't trust that media, then it's your responsibility to question their authority, to doubt the information that you've been given. Third, and we already saw this one, the more time the media spend debunking these facts, the more suspicious it makes them. Think of a conspiracy theory such as Pizzagate that linked Hillary Clinton to a child trafficking ring run out of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. Most people had never heard of that conspiracy theory. Most people had never heard of this conspiracy story. But when they saw the mainstream media going nuts trying to debunk it, that's when their ears perked up. 5. The cultural focus on experience over expertise. Civil rights leaders, as well as the black existentialist philosophers, for instance, that we've discussed last week, have been arguing for decades for the importance of respecting experience. There is a great need to hear the voices of people of color, for instance, who are so often ignored by experts. You could call it a epistemological solidarity with the people whose story you're trying to analyze. Now, this message has taken hold more broadly. Even lower class white men now feel underrepresented in politics. See, for instance, the All Lives Matter counter-protests as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. So, Boyd argues that what is needed here is not just more objective facts, more fake news labels by experts, more control by Facebook and Twitter, and so on. She writes, addressing so-called fake news is going to require a lot more than labeling. It's going to require a cultural change about how we make sense of information, whom we trust, and how we understand our own role in grappling with information. Quick and easy solutions may make the controversy go away, but they won't address the underlying problems. This difficulty to distinguish facts from alternative facts, or facts from opinions, leads us back to week 1 and the discussion on epistemology. It also leads us to the research that we're doing in this course. How do we know that particular opinions that we see are facts? What kind of evidence is needed in anonymous online discussion forums in order for opinions to become viewed as facts? When we look at Reddit, it's worth considering how different communities deal with the distinction between facts and opinion. The platform as a whole creates something of a myth about the communities it fosters. On the webpage that introduces the platform, the authors define Reddit as a home to thousands of communities, endless conversation, and authentic human connection. Many communities on Reddit follow this logic of subjectivism. Take, for instance, the Change My View subreddit, where members can post opinions that can then be challenged by other members. Discussions within this community are collectively labeled as concerning views. Both users and moderators of this subreddit, in their discussions, do not clearly draw a line between opinions and facts. One way to understand these kinds of interactions on Reddit is by comparing the platform to something like Facebook. From its inception, Facebook has implemented a real name policy. It's all about the authenticity of the user. Here's a quote by Mark Zuckerberg where he gives that sort of a moral spin, noting that having multiple identities shows a lack of integrity. This morality about the authentic user, something that, by the way, is very much criticized for its inherent intrusion into people's privacy, is opposed to the kinds of web platforms such as Reddit or 4chan and so on, which are all about anonymity, ephemerality, provocation, and irony. They're very much embedded in that sense into early 90s web culture. What I want to point out is that anonymity is not just a vehicle for fake news and disinformation, it's also an alternative to this ideology of individualization and authenticity that we see in dominant Western internet culture. It's been pointed out that the discourse on platforms such as Reddit has certain characteristics. It tends to be anti and impersonal rather than personal. People don't really know each other in these spaces as one would in a traditional community. Interactions tend to be ephemeral and aleatory rather than persistent and predictable. Shared interests, alliances, and enemies come and go. Tends to be collective rather than individual. It's about groups of people a lot of the time. It tends to be stranger rather than friend-oriented. Most of the people meeting there do not know each other. It tends to be radically public and contagious rather than privatized, filtered, and contained. You don't really know where these interactions are going. Finally, Subreddits are marked both by multiplicity and single voices. It's both a coherent single discourse and marked by a lot of diversity. Which of these two is more characteristic of the community you're looking at is, in the end, an analytical decision that you have to make for yourself. The anonymity and ephemerality of platforms such as Reddit ensure that speech acts cannot be traced back to a single authorial source. This, like I just said, problematizes this idea that authors have the final say on what their own text means. The intentional fallacy that we discussed in week 2 has here become an inevitability. We can't even know what these people really think because we don't know who they are. A final interesting phenomenon in this regard is what's called Bos Law. This is an internet axiom about the impossibility to establish sincerity in online content. It says, without a clear indicator of the author's intent, it is impossible to create a parody of extreme views so obviously exaggerated that it cannot be mistaken by some readers for a sincere expression of the parodied views. In other words, any extremist or out there comment about something could be mistaken for something sincere, no matter how ridiculous or outrageous it is. There's a relation between Bos Law and what we this week are calling platform hermeneutics. The issue is that we are always having to resort to some degree of guesswork when it comes to what it is that people mean in these anonymized settings. We are working with technology in order to excavate some patterns of meaning in these texts, but we also face technology as a setting that complicates the finality of any interpretive analysis that we could engage in. As I mentioned, people are trying to resolve this problem. Facebook does it by placing trust in authenticity and agency. Another response is one of pragmatism. When we call particular expressions hate speech, for instance, we typically don't refer to the intention behind a speech act, but to the effects on its receiver. But when we focus on these effects, we need to ask ourselves, is this all that matters? Is there no other way of looking at the playfulness and irony that characterizes a lot of these interactions? These are open questions, ones that I hope you'll be able to engage with in your digital essays. In this week's class, we will further discuss Ihde's work, postphenomenology, and the epistemic issues of doing hermeneutic research on Reddit. Looking forward to seeing you there.